Jibajitunda. Olonde, the one that fits ya. Katikende Jibajitunda. Olonde, the one that fits.
Yusef or Vene, was this your first time like reading this book, or were you familiar with this book before? I know Vene, you said you listened to it, but Yusef, was this your first time?
With it, but I never like had the chance to read it. Yeah.
So I remember reading this book back in like the start of secondary school, but it was different rereading it now, because obviously with experience and with everything that's been going on over the last few years, it hits different. That's what I'll say. It's completely different from what I read many years ago. I have a different appreciation for it now.
Yeah, I mean, I was tempted to kind of like wait until everyone else joins in so we can hear what people thought.
Yeah.
But because, you know, people are running a little bit late, we might as well get started now, innit? Because we're here.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Yusuf, you're saying it hits differently because of like your experience and you're older. Like, what did you think about it before? And then what do you think about it now?
I think obviously before, you're reading the book in the context of being in school, and you're reading a book in the context of having to write an essay, having to, you know, get sort of the main themes and describe the themes. And it's very structured when you're reading it in school. However, reading it outside of that context, as an adult who's got formed opinions about politics, about history, you have a different appreciation for it. There's a lot of things that I had to go off and read to sort of get context, which I didn't do the first time I read the book.
Great. Welcome, James.
Hello.
Welcome. Yeah, so how are you?
I'm okay.
Have you met anyone else here? Like, do you know anyone here? I'm sure you
know
Katasi.
I know Katasi.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, nice to meet you. I'm Kalungi.
Hello, Kalungi.
Nice to meet you, James and Yusuf.
Hi, James. Nice to meet you. I'm Vene.
Hi.
Hi, James. Thanks for joining. I'm so happy you've joined because you're the biggest bookworm I know.
Okay.
Brace yourselves, like. Yeah, James has some really interesting ideas, and I'm looking forward to hearing them as well.
Okay. Well, all right. Well, James, Yusuf was just telling us that he'd read the book before in school, and he was kind of making a comparison between his kind of experience reading it whilst he was in school, and then his experience reading it now whilst while he's older. So, Yusuf, do you want to like just tell James what you said?
Sorry, I'll repeat myself. So yeah, James, is it your first time reading the book, James?
I haven't actually read it yet.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So
that's
when I was told about the book club,
yeah,
it was kind of quite short notice.
Yeah.
But I've read about the book, so I know about Chinua Achebe. I've read different reviews on Goodreads. Yes, I know stuff about the book.
Yeah. So what I was saying is that it's quite different reading the book as well in school, because it's very structured. Whereas if you're reading it as an adult, you've formed opinions about certain things that happen in society, and you've got a history, you've got experiences, and it's a different appreciation for the book. And I felt like a lot of things I had to sort of cross-reference and get a better context about what was happening at the time and before Chinua actually wrote the book.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it really helped watching that documentary that Kalungi shared in the group a couple of weeks ago about like, what was it called, Kalungi?
It was the novels that shaped Africa.
Yeah. That really helped put context around it and understanding the time he was writing in and like why it was so seminal. Because I think if I just took it as a book like that was written today, I would not have the appreciation for it. Just because, I felt like it was much slower, or there's others that have come after and have written like, about African stories, but it being so like groundbreaking, And given that it was a Black person, an African person writing it, compared to everything else that was like mainstream and white.
So Katasi, you're saying that the documentary helped, like, your appreciation of the context, like it put the novel into context.
Yeah, it put it into context, and I think I would have ended up having done the same as Yusef, like trying to research around it and understanding that, you know, this was the first of its kind at the time, hence making it to the literary canon. Yeah, it did really help, because, I mean, in some ways, I felt like it took a very long time to get to the crux of it for me. I was like, things are falling apart, but very, very slowly. And, you know, this book's 150 pages long, and yeah, I'm thinking, when is this white person gonna turn up? Like very calm, very normal, and then it's like it's page 150 or something. No, 100. That, you know, it was only 50 more pages to go. I'm like, oh, it's been a little bit delayed, but then upon reflection, I think that's really okay, because it gave him license just to talk about the ordinariness of like African life and like life in the village, because we know there's enough books about colonialism and those but just being able to relate to that and thinking about like the Ugandan context perhaps was actually like, that's quite radical in itself. Like, I'm gonna take my time and like paint a picture of what was. I don't know how everyone else felt.
No, I agree, because yeah, I was reading it as well. I was like you, I was like, when are things gonna fall apart? Because, you know, obviously when he's the title of the book, innit? So, but actually I've read this book a few times, and each time that I read it, I'm always surprised by what's gonna happen next. So it's always like it always feels fresh and new. And for some reason, like, I'm always surprised. Like, I know something's gonna happen. I know there's that big twist at the end, but how they got there is always such a surprise. And this time I was like you, I was reading, it was actually, upon reflection, it is a bit of a slow burner, even though it's only about 150, 200 pages, right? But at the end, when things started falling apart, and of course that's not the point of the novel, but then it started to pick up, and I, you know, started building up momentum. And you're right, Katasi, like, I felt like it was a purposeful thing that he did to give the kind of the mundaneness and the ordinary lives that these, you know, Nigerian characters lived, or these African characters lived, possibly before it was named Nigeria. So it was really interesting to read that, the pre-colonial aspect, and I kind of kept kind of asking myself, like, damn, like when they saw, I kept wondering actually, what would I have done in that situation? You know, if I was Okonkwo, if I was like the other characters, would I have, like, you know, given in and joined the missionaries, and would I have like contributed to bringing down my clan? Like, you know, because in a way, it feels like Chinua is saying that a lot of us were complicit in this kind of permitting of the, you know, the colonizers, because when they came in, you know, his fellow clan members, some of them didn't put up a fight. You know that village that I think Abemu or Abeme village that gets, you know, massacred in that while he's away from Umofia. Like, I kept asking myself, why didn't they put up a fight? But then there was a really interesting sentence that I highlighted or took a picture of, but I'll remember it. And he was saying that part of the reason why maybe some people didn't put up a fight was because they came with Christianity and this religion, and they seemed really silly, you know, they seemed harmless, you know, it didn't seem like they could do any harm. And then gradually, you know, they started kind of implementing their, you know, their colonial kind of measures. And by then it was too late. They'd embedded themselves into their society. And yeah, it was really tragic. It was such a tragic end. Oh man, I was so sad because it's happened to our countries, like, you know.
What did it make you think of how does it make you think about Christianity and the role it has in Africa today, especially coming from a Ugandan background?
Anyone want to answer that?
I'll answer it. I just, like you guys know, I didn't finish the whole book, but what I found interesting, and I agree with Kalungi, is like, even though I didn't finish the book, when you're talking about how in the beginning some of the people were just so accommodating of the British coming, even though they'd never seen a white person before. There was like a foreign person in their land that didn't speak their language, completely different culture, everything like that. And I was actually watching a documentary yesterday. I don't know if you guys have watched it. It's on BBC. It was on BBC years ago, and I think it's called Lost Kingdoms of Africa. And
yes.
So the second episode was about Uganda and the story of Bunyoro and Buganda, and how the Bunyoro used to be like basically like the main. I wouldn't say like, but it was like Bunyoro and Buganda. Like Bunyoro was like a bigger group than the Buganda tribe, and you then see how they were talking about how they used to how salt was like a very valuable mineral that they used to create, and obviously Buganda had the bark cloth and the matoke. And then it then talks about how when the missionaries then came and how the Buganda tribe were accommodating of them, and how the Buganda tribe let the missionaries in because I think at the time they wanted help to overthrow the Bunyoro tribe and be the domineering tribe. And then it then showed that how by them letting the British come in, obviously they took over, they colonized blah, blah, and Uganda is what it is today. But it was also very interesting how they were highlighting like how they came obviously with Christianity. And to answer your point, James, I mean, some people will argue, and not a lot of people will argue and say that, you know, the missionaries brought Christianity, and you know how they used Christianity to enslave our people, and they used it for negativity and things like that. But then there's other sources that say that Christianity was in Africa before the slaveries came. So I don't know how I feel about it. I mean, obviously it was used in a really negative way, but at the same time, there's other sources that show that Christianity was there. So I don't know if, in my personal opinion, I don't know if Christianity can be seen as such a negative thing and a driving thing that caused whatever happened in the continent. I don't know if I'm making sense.
No, you're making absolute sense.
Okay,
I wanted to read this quote that I was talking about. It says, "The white man is very clever. He came quietly and peaceably with his religion. We were amused at his foolishness and allowed him to stay. Now he has won our brothers, and our clan can no longer act like one. He has put a knife on the things that held us together, and we have fallen apart." And I love that quote. And obviously other people on Kindle liked it as well because they all highlighted it.
I liked that quote too. Yeah, it was really powerful.
It's powerful. Like, and Vene, you're right. Like, there's a documentary hosted by Zainab Hussein, I think, on BBC, on the BBC YouTube account. And it's, you know, it's like 20 plus episodes, and it's literally the history of Africa, effectively. And it goes in a lot more detail than the Lost Kingdoms of Africa. And it talks about exactly that, what you just said, that, you know, Christianity, you know, entered Africa long before the missionaries came. But I guess maybe it may have been kind of like, I would have to double check this, but it may have been concentrated in certain areas. And
I think it was around Ethiopia.
Exactly.
So Sudan and Ethiopia.
Exactly. So in this kind of areas, maybe it hadn't really kind of made its way there. And in answer to your question, Yusef, did it change the way I saw Christianity? I mean, this is actually one of the books that did make me change my view on Christianity when I first read it a few years back, because, you know, it was almost like, it disrupted the kind of the everyday life and maybe the progress of these Africans, these characters in Chinua Achebe's book. And you always wonder what would have happened if this brand of Christianity hadn't made its way to the individual tribes and clans and so on and so forth. So yeah, it definitely kind of made me go, damn, like where would we have been had we not embraced this? And of course, even in that documentary actually that Vene talked about, or maybe in other kind of like sources, the Christianity that came in, like the kings, like our own king Kabaka, embraced that Christianity, but he also embraced Islam at the same time. I think it might have been the one that preceded Mwanga.
Manja.
Ani? Who?
Manja the second.
It might have been the second, it might have been the first one. Forgive me, it might be Mutesa the first. I might be wrong, but he embraced it because he saw value in it. He actually asked his pages and the people that worked with him to go and learn from Islam and learn from Christianity and everything. But I guess they didn't think that it was going to end in the way it ended. They just thought it was going to be good.
Yusef, just from your name, I'm assuming you are Muslim. Just from your name.
Yeah, I am.
Did you think that this would do you have any comments about what's being said in terms of Islam's applicability to this situation?
Yeah, I do. So I saw it from a different perspective actually. I think, and I always think, that it's quite important to separate religion from culture, especially Western culture. And I think when the missionaries arrived, when the white man arrived in Nigeria, so the religion aspect of things was fine. So I don't think that's what disrupted, the culture and the traditions that Okonkwo was used to. I think what actually disrupted that is the white man's culture and his way of doing things. He introduced his own government and a way of judging people when they sin. And that's something, they had their own traditions and had their own way of punishing each other. So I think it's all the other things that came with the religion which actually affected the way of life as opposed to Christianity itself. And I think, to answer your question more directly, if we bring that back to now and what's happening in the world now and what we think about Islam and Christianity, I think we always confuse the two together. Well, not everyone, but generally there's a tendency to think about religion with culture, and I think it's very important to separate that. And I always give this opinion about some of my friends. You'd think that if you're Muslim and you come from a certain country, you're expected to act a certain way, right? But actually, no, the way you act is more influenced by your culture and as opposed to your religion. And so that's why I think, for me, I saw it quite differently. I understand why they thought Christianity was the issue and why that was the disruption, but I think it was actually the humanity part of things, the culture part of things, the white man's culture that actually disrupted their way of life and not the Christianity itself. The reason being is that Christianity itself answered a lot of questions that some people in the village were questioning for a while, Okonkwo-san being one of them. He'd questioned why they get rid of twins, why things happened. And I think it's part of sort of evolution and through the way you go through generations for people to question things and to question the old way of doing things. And I think Christianity answered that question for most of them. For some of them, and that's why they converted. So I don't think Christianity was the essence of the problem. I think it was the Western culture that was the problem.
Ooh, okay. I would disagree.
Because I think that culture, I think religion informs culture is so embedded. You know, when you're raised with a religion, it's in your mind, it's part of your mantras. It really changes the way that you look at the world. And I feel like I've spoken to different people, different Africans from different backgrounds, you know, in terms of the way that they think of themselves and they think about their traditions. And I realized that nobody today can talk with an unbiased perspective on what the pre-colonial time was like. in terms of how they viewed their spirituality, how they kind of understood and thought about God, how they thought about so many different things because of the way that religion works. You know, when you speak to people who've been converted, who've been raised in a religion, they can't talk about their ancestors. You know, they can't talk for their ancestors. They can't see from the perspective of people who had a tradition that hadn't had that, and they had never been they hadn't had no interaction with an Abrahamic faith, or from the perspective of an Abrahamic faith. And you can see that when you speak to people from India, for example. You know, as somebody who's been raised in the tradition of Hinduism doesn't look, for example, at their sculptures and think it's idolatry. You know, that's not in their mindset, you know, because that's not the perspective of their religion and their culture. You know, so I think the difficult thing is with Christianity, I feel like, especially that even how missionaries work today, you know, they come and they bring things that do add value. You know, so okay, there's literacy, for example. So it's kind of they come in under the kind of the preconception that, okay, we're going to give you literacy, we're going to give you schools, and then we're going to change your entire mindset in terms of your spiritual basis based on that. You know, and I think it's flawed because I've been reading about indigenous cultures. You know, I've been reading about, for example, people of Australian Aborigines. You know, it's unfair that the diversity of the way that humanity thinks about spirituality becomes devalued the moment that Christianity comes in, and they start telling you this is the right way. What you believe is wrong. This is what God looks like. This is what God is.
Yeah, you know? James, I completely agree with you. And my argument is not that. My argument is that when you're having a discussion about what the cause is, you should be able to separate the religion from the culture. And I think once we're able to do that, when we're able to identify elements that could be different, and the only way we can do that is to be aware that they are different. They are intertwined, yes, and they are affected by the other, but they are essentially different. Sorry, and a Muslim from Saudi Arabia would be a completely different person from a Muslim from Uganda. Yes, they share the same thing, but they have different values and they have different ways of living.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say exactly that example. I lived in Saudi Arabia, and I obviously Islamic country, but the interpretation of Islam is very, very different to the interpretation of the Muslims that I met in Kampala. So I think there's a distinction in terms of how people choose to adhere to their cultures and various things. And James, specific in the book, they don't come in. It's not an aggressive takeover. It's very gentle. You know, ultimately in the book, Achebe doesn't even spell it out. Like, this isn't black and white in the book in terms of colonialism is bad. I think what happens is that people are given a choice, and a choice to think for themselves and say, well, what about the outcasts? So seeing all those outcasts joined the church.
Are you talking about the Aussie? They have the Aussie caste system when you talk about the outcasts.
I'm talking about the book.
Okay.
In the book, the villagers decide to join the church, not because they actually understand or have clarity about who this mystical God is, but really there's a gentleness. And like, I found that really hard to accept, because, you know, you want it to just be this very abrasive takeover, but it wasn't. His quote, the quote that Kalungi wrote, it's a very, very subtle change or introduction to like the bigger things of governance, and then it gets aggressive.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I just say one thing? So I know Kalungi, you mentioned a line that you thought was very sort of defining for the book, which I do agree. But there was something else that they mentioned about how, I don't know if I can remember the exact line, but how it's to sort of back up my point with regards to the religion and culture. When, if you remember, when he mentions that the Queen, you will not, something along the line that we will not stand this in the for my Majesty the Queen, or something like that, which for me extended, that's extending beyond religion and going towards governance.
Yeah.
We will not accept this type of behavior in my queen's and under my queen's rule. So he's extended that sort of queen's rule to that land, regardless of whether it's Christianity or not. And that's what I think most people actually had a problem with.
Yeah, but isn't that an element? Because I think when it comes to things like schooling and literacy, so from what I've read in terms of colonial situations in Africa, even in Uganda, they have power. So when I was reading about Mwanja II, what he saw, when you've got people who are illiterate now, who can read, who can write, there's an element of power to it. Like you can't. It's very difficult to compete. And I guess I've always had the issue with kind of with missionaries, in the sense that, okay, you want to go to help these people, but your intentions, like, what are really your intentions? I look at people like, okay, I look at, say, the hunter-gatherers in Africa today. Is teaching them about the devil and Jesus benefiting them? Aren't you supposed to help people to help themselves if you're supposed to be charity? How come you come to help people, but then you bring you bring this religion and this theological framework, and then you tell them this is the way things should be? I guess that's the issue that I've had.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I agree with you guys. I was gonna say that I feel like what you said, Yusef, in regards to maybe it wasn't Christianity or the introduction of Christianity that led to things falling apart. Correct me if I'm wrong in that kind of analysis.
Yeah.
But I kind of feel like it was. I feel like it. I disagree with that, because my understanding is, the missionaries that entered Africa, they came with what is known as the white man's burden. So they came with the understanding that these Africans were savages. They needed rescuing. They needed, some sort of, again, enlightenment in the form of Christianity. And again, that Christianity, or that view, was kind of, I guess, highlighted with their interpretation of Christianity, where it's the story of like Noah and his sons, Ham and everything, and them being descendants of Ham, so on and so forth. So they felt like we were cursed and we needed, some sort of like religious intervention. And that was their burden to do so. And I feel like that's what Achebe has written in this, in that, he's introduced us to their everyday life. Of course, Okonkwo, has many wives. He mistreats Nwoye, but he really loves Ezinma. He may not respect his mother's clan, but he loves his father's clan. And when you said that some of the, I guess, the converted, they went to Christianity because Christianity answered some of the questions. You're absolutely right, because even in the Ugandan context, it's said by historians that some of the Ugandans joined Christianity because they saw King Mutesa I was sick, and he just wasn't getting better. And the Buganda kingdom used to be so powerful, and they were thinking, well, if the king can't get better, we need to find, we need to find these answers to these questions. We need to, maybe our religion and our kind of beliefs aren't helping us because they don't even help the king. So maybe Christianity or Islam is going to be of help. But I think in the context of maybe Nwoye or some of the characters in Things Fall Apart, Nwoye saw his dad, Okonkwo, pretty much get involved in the murder of his brother, his adopted brother, Ifemefuna. Ifemefuna. His dad mistreated him, didn't see him as a son, saw him as a woman, and so forth. So he was almost like rebelling. And sometimes some people, and I don't want to kind of put a blanket statement on the Africans who converted, but sometimes they converted to rebel against, families and what their clans and the restrictions of their clans. And you saw that in Nwoye and potentially maybe other characters that decided to kind of like join the missionaries.
Yeah.
But for me, again, it's this the passiveness of the people that really frustrated me, because maybe Achebe didn't go into too much detail, but what was his name? What was that man's name? The colonizer, the administrator.
Oh, Miss Smith. Is it Smith?
Smith.
The second guy or the first guy?
Okay.
The second.
The lead,
like, Mr. Brown.
Mr. Brown, like he doesn't.
Good guy. The so-called good guy.
He doesn't come like, it's like a bad cop, good cop, isn't it? He doesn't really come with anything too compelling. It's all very general, like you're worshipping stones or whatever. But like if someone came and told me that, like that doesn't seem compelling enough for me to then just switch and like cease any sort of like interaction with my people. So I just felt really frustrated at the portrayal of like the passiveness of the Africans. I don't know if anyone else felt that kind of rage, because it just didn't seem like there was any, and then it looked like it was a little bit of serendipity. So when they gave him the plot of land to build the church in the forest where all their demonic things were happening, you know, he was resilient and he made it through it. And then that was a sign to him that this is the man, like his God is more superior. Again,
it's like it suggests that we were so simple, like very simple-minded, like
So I think I agree with you, Katasi, but I also think that yes, there was a level of passiveness, but it was because they thought it was a joke and they didn't think Christianity was serious. They thought the guy was mad and everything that he was suggesting was just absolutely ridiculous. And I think that's why they didn't take it seriously. And I think we'd all agree with that. But I also think, as you realized, when you got halfway through the book, and you've already mentioned this, things happened quite quickly. So in the first 70% of the book, you know, he's laying out this whole background about how Africa is, the life, and you know, it gets boring halfway through it, and then you're like, actually, I need to appreciate this because he's actually trying to paint a picture here. And I think this is the point where I asked myself, why did he write this book? Why did he decide to write this book? And I actually realized that it was in response to The Heart of Darkness, which, you know, when I read the book the first time, I didn't know that. And
was it Roger Kipling?
Sorry?
Was that a Kipling book? Kipling.
Conrad.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Of Conrad?
Oh, Conrad,
yeah. Oh, is it? Yeah, it was Conrad. And I realized at that point that actually he needed to do that. He needed to write a book that completely showed what Africans were like, that they had a culture, they had a way of life, and that they had, you know, they had seasons and they could farm and they could do all these things, and they had a system of justice. They had their own way, and they had their own religion. However messed up the white man thought that was, they had their own way of life. And I think when you get to, you know, chapter 14 or 15, I don't remember exactly which point, that's when things start falling apart quite rapidly for Okonkwo in his personal life and for his village as well. And I think there's a good contrast between, a good sort of similarity between the two. You know, he gets exiled, he moves to another place, he can't be, you know, he loses respect. And we all know his respect is the main thing for him. He has to be a man and he has to be respected. And I think his masculinity is defined by the culture. And that's why he rejects his father and rejects his son. And so I think, yes, they were passive, but I think we need to consider that this, you know, evolutions do happen, and this is how they happen. Things are usually fine, but when things start to go wrong, they go wrong quite quickly. And people don't expect them to go wrong quite quickly because they're very comfortable, or they're very proud. And his tribe was very proud, and they thought, well, we won't let that happen to us. But when it started happening, it started happening quite quickly. There's an evolution in ideas, an evolution in ways of thinking, an evolution in how people did things. And I think it's the surprising nature of how it happened as opposed to their passiveness. So I don't particularly blame them for not putting up such a fight. I think it was shocking and it was surprising for all of them.
Yeah, I think it's also important to know that there was flaws in Igbo culture, because you know Chinua Achebe is Igbo.
Yeah.
You know, so like for example, that thing with twins, it's not necessarily in their spirituality, but it was just a cultural taboo. They thought twins were an abomination.
Yeah.
And it's like interesting that because they and the Yoruba are among the tribes that have the highest rates of twinning, but their attitudes are so opposite. So for Yoruba people, twins are a blessing. For the Igbo, twins are traditionally an abomination. You know, so and other than that, I know that there's like also the Osu. I don't know if that came up in the book. They have this thing called the Osu caste system. So there's like a segment of society who are labeled Osu, and they're effectively like slaves or outcasts.
Yeah,
and kind of they're treated they're almost like untouchables, almost like the untouchables of India. That's how they're treated. You know, they're not allowed to go to the same shrine. There's all these things in society that kind of outcast them and other them, and it's hereditary. So from that perspective, there is like I can see how if you are an Osu and you look at Christianity and think, okay, the message of Jesus is inclusive, you know, I can see how sometimes in cultures you can look at something and say, okay, we can take this on, because looking at the flaws that already exist in our own culture. But I think it's flawed to think that Christianity is the only way for people to evolve, because if you look across the world, there's been different ideologies. You know, Buddhism was born out of Hinduism, but it's a completely different religion. You know, people are able to look at their own cultures and say, okay, that this is something that we don't do anymore. In the same way that the Chinese, they used to do that foot binding of women. They used to practice female infanticide was a thing that was commonly practiced. You know, but they were able to, over time, to evolve and look back and say, okay, these are things that we can change. I feel like it doesn't necessarily have to be Christianity be the only way for people to evolve and to move forwards.
I wanted to take a conversation away from religion for a moment.
Yeah.
How did you find the representation of women in the book? Oh, and like Vene, did you, in the stuff that you saw of the adaptation, did you sort of see any themes around women? Because for me, I just found it, of course he's writing at the time, so I found lots of the references quite demeaning, like it was almost an insult to be a woman, like you're crying like a woman, or that's woman's talk or whatever. But then at the same time, and then the way that Okonkwo treated his wives, you know, beating them over really petty things, or when they had when the spirits came and they were trying to rectify the domestic issue, again, it was trivialized that the woman was being beaten, even during her, like throughout her pregnancy. But then again, I think Achebe is really skillful at this. Things are never presented as they're always dualistic, right? So at the same time, you had the priestess who had a lot of power because she took away their child, and Zima, and God knows what she would have done with the child. I mean, we can imagine, but she had a lot of power. And then towards the end, when he's appreciating his mother's village, initially there's like a lack of appreciation because he's been exiled. But then, excuse me, like the label of like Supreme Mother or Mother Supreme from Naneka kind of then challenges everything else that I was initially thinking about, how, well, this is actually really demeaning. I don't know what everyone else thought.
Yeah, and Vene, your mic's is on mute.
Yeah, I've done that deliberately. I mean, I agree with you, Katasi, when you were talking about that whole domestic issue. I think that happened towards the beginning of the book, so I actually caught that. I personally don't feel as if I caught a lot of the themes around women, but I do totally agree with what you were saying of how, you know, that situation wasn't taken seriously. But I think from what I saw, from the little bit of what I heard even, it was, I think back in the day, and obviously still to this day to a certain extent in different cultures and countries within Africa, it's sort of seen as if like when you're a woman, it's like you're lower than a man basically, and you have to, like in that situation with the marriage, you sort of have to like suck things up, or you're a woman if you're experiencing something, that it's sort of like normalized that, okay, those are certain things that you just have to overcome within a marriage, and you just have to accept, because at the end of the day, you're married to that man, and you're basically, you how can I say, it's like, yeah, you're married to that man, and it's like there it's like the man's way or the highway. But even if you want to leave, it's sort of, if you do leave, you're sort of shunned and you're looked down and on all these things. So I feel like, yeah, I don't know if I'm ranting on a bit, but I feel as if maybe he was trying to highlight that the role of women within society at that time. And even reading those themes and seeing those themes, it's still quite relevant today in certain circumstances and certain cultures. Not even in just Africa, maybe in Asia as well. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Katasi, what do you think about the fact that despite how he described women in the book and how they were portrayed, the amount of respect he had for Zimba, his own daughter, and how he elevated her beyond his own sons? And I found that very endearing, because he contrasted the fact that, you know, this is how our culture and our tradition sees women, but look at my daughter, and my daughter has all these attributes, but I wish she was a boy, because then everyone else could see the attributes that she has. So I found that very, I found that very endearing.
Yeah, again, it's just like this conflict. Like in one instance, he's like beating his wife, to pulp. But at the same time, he loves his daughter. But that continuous reference of, I wish she was a boy, then just taints it a little bit for me. But yeah, that was interesting about and the love for his mother's village, and how in the end they took him in. Yeah, I did like that relationship.
Yeah, and I think the way I took that, the way he described his daughter, was he wanted her to be a boy, not because that's what he wanted. I think he wanted her to be a boy just to highlight to everyone else all her attributes. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because only the man was respected in that culture. So it was such a masculine thing that a woman's voice was completely irrelevant. And he felt that she had more to give the world than his own sons. And so I felt like, yes, he did have a huge amount of respect for her. Though misplaced sometimes, but I think, yeah, I took it positively, I think.
Knowing, because I was reading it thinking, like, I know what the ending's going to be, and it reminded me of when I was watching Romeo and Juliet with, what's his name? What's the guy's name? Like, when it came out in the 90s, like, you knew that you'd read the book and you knew what the outcome was going to be. Like,
was it Leonardo DiCaprio?
Leonardo DiCaprio, yeah.
Right? Like, and you knew that there was absolutely no alternative in the ending. Like, they were going to kill themselves, right? And then reading this, I just knew what the outcome would be. But that's because, we've got the foresight, because we know how colonialism works. And like you say, Christine, like, they didn't understand the machinery of what was actually before them. So they did undermine it. But then at the same time, Okonkwo had that fighting spirit, and maybe he had this foresight that others didn't, because he was questioning. But then I guess that the scene at the end where they're captured, and then these additional 12 guards come in, and then they capture them and they imprison them. I felt like that was, as warriors, I think you could have come a bit stronger than that, because they're depicted as these very capable warriors. I don't know.
But that's the thing, though. I feel like throughout the book, Achebe was kind of like showing us that the other characters had a problem with Okonkwo's strength, because he literally had such a temper that sometimes he couldn't even get his words out, and it felt like gradually the other characters were kind of like feeling some type of way about that. And that was frustrating him, because he was remembering the days of his, maybe his ancestors, and the days of his own kind of youth, where brute force was the most, I guess, admired quality. But for some reason, all the other kind of like leaders and maybe neighboring clans or fellow clan members just didn't really have that strength anymore. And I feel like by the time the white man had entered, he possibly capitalized on that. He capitalized on the fact that they probably didn't want to fight and war anymore, you know, and at towards the end where they're kind of summoned to go to Mr. Smith, I think that's his name, the second guy who comes in, and they're spoken to like little children, you know, and you can sense, obviously through kind of Achebe's narration, that Okonkwo wishes that all the other kind of men were like him, and they were like strong, and they were ready to get the machetes and go and really start beef, but they just didn't have that willingness anymore. And you know, maybe it began with the fact that they killed Ifemefuna. Maybe that was the beginning of that. The loss of that young boy who they put into society and assimilated into society, and then they killed him. So some of these practices, like you guys were saying, maybe these, I guess, Umofians, they were getting tired of these practices. And one of those practices was probably showing brute force. So they gradually lost their strength. So by the time it was time to kind of like start beef and get ready for war, they just didn't have that anymore. And Okonkwo was one man, and he couldn't fight them all, you know?
With regards to the strength and Okonkwo, I think it's clear that his destiny was, you know, he created his own destiny, regardless of whether his father was a weak man, a man who could not elevate himself in society. Okonkwo decided very early on that he would not be like his father, and he would be a strong man, and he would do everything that he could to elevate his position in society. And I think there's a lot of similarities that you can draw in current society as well. I think we still have the same values, and I'm not just saying just men, just generally. I think people still have the same values of defining their own destiny and having that control. But I think it was quite ironic how he kept referring back to his chi, and the fact that his destiny was not in sync with his chi. And, you know, his fight against that throughout the whole book, and the fact that he thought he was better than that, and he thought his chi was wrong, and he was destined for greatness, and he was destined to defeat the missionaries. And I think the turning point for him was when he was exiled. And I think at this point, I don't know if you guys realize this, but he started sort of reflecting quite a lot. And I think if you look at any great character in society or in history, they're quite eccentric, they're different, they're audacious, and you know, they have foresight, and this is everything that Okonkwo actually had. But the one thing that he actually lacked, which James mentioned before, was literacy. And I think if he had this, I mean, he had all the ingredients for greatness apart from literacy. And that's what the missionaries brought. And if it had literacy, then he would have had he would have had sort of the higher order thinking, the higher level of thinking, and the foresight to actually see that they were sly, they were cunning. Sorry. Yeah, so they were sly, they were cunning, and they were very opportunistic, and they arguably used religion and their way of thinking to take over. But it was done in a very sly and in a very cunning way. It's a very opportunistic way. And they knew that once they'd, you know, had a few people on their side, that it would be done, and that would be it. And if Okonkwo was literate, then this would have surpassed his strength, because that would have been his greatest strength.
Mm.
Yeah. I don't know about you, Katasi, but I think this has been such an incredible first session. I mean, I can go on talking about this for 5 more hours, but obviously it might be torture for some people. Okay, well,
thank you very much, guys. Very nice meeting you.
Thank you.
Nice
Thank you.
The one that fits ya. Say I know she can mash it up, she put it in reverse just to show she can back it up. The kick that she make is hers, so she stuck it up. Natural woman, she not feel